Welcome back to Under the Willow Tree, where we gather in the hush between myth and memory. Tonight, we light a candle for 5 children lost to fire and silence: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder, whose names still echo through the hills of Fayetteville, West Virginia. It was Christmas Eve, 1945. A blaze devoured their home, but no bodies were ever found. Theories bloomed: arson, abduction, even mafia revenge. Their parents never stopped searching and never stopped believing. Before we begin, a gentle warning: this episode contains discussions of child loss, unresolved trauma, and disturbing historical details. Listener discretion is advised. The Sodder children were the first cold case I ever stumbled into, and it never let go. Their story, 5 siblings vanished into the firelight of Christmas Eve, unfolded just a few hills over from where I grew up. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, it's one of many mysteries stitched into Appalachian landscape. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1945, a fire destroyed the Sodder residence. The house was home to George Sodder, his wife Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children when the fire broke out. As flames consumed the structure, George, Jenny, and 4 of the children managed to escape. The other 5 were never found. Not in the ashes, not anywhere. For the rest of their lives, the surviving Sodders clung to the haunting belief that the missing 5 had not perished, but somehow, somewhere, had survived. The Sodders never rebuilt the home that was lost. Instead, they transformed the ground into a quiet memorial garden, a sacred space to honor the 5 children who vanished that night. It became a place of remembrance, of mourning, and of hope. In the 1950s, as questions outnumbered answers and the ache of uncertainty deepened, the family erected a billboard along State Route 16. It bore the faces of the missing children and a heartfelt plea for truth, offering a reward to anyone who could help bring closure. For decades, it stood as both a beacon and a vigil, watched over by Jenny Sodder until her passing in 1989, after which the sign was gently taken down. The Sodders family believed that their children had survived the fire was not born of denial, but of deep intuitive unrest, fueled by a series of strange and troubling details surrounding the night of the blaze. George Sodder challenged the official finding that the fire was electrical in origin, pointing out that the house had recently been rewired and passed inspection. He and Jenny suspected something far more sinister: arson. Whispers of retaliation began to surface, tied to George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and the fascist regime in his native Italy. Some speculated that the children had been taken, perhaps by the Sicilian mafia, in a cruel act of vengeance. Despite state and federal investigations in the early 1950s, no new answers emerged, but the family never stopped searching. In the 1960s, they received a photograph, possibly one of the missing boys, now grown. It was never confirmed, but it reignited hope. Sylvia Sodder, the youngest and last surviving sibling, carried the torch into the 21st century, alongside her children and grandchildren. She kept the story alive through interviews, articles, and online forums, refusing to let the mystery fade into silence. Now, let's take a step back here and look into the background leading up to the event. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in Tola, Sardinia in 1895. At 13, he immigrated to the U.S. with his older brother, who returned to Italy soon after they arrived at Ellis Island. But George stayed and rarely spoke of why he left. George Sodder began his American life working the railroads in Pennsylvania, hauling water and supplies for labor crews. In time, he settled in Smithers, West Virginia, where he found steadier work as a driver. Eventually, he built his own trucking company, first hauling fill dirt and then coal from the surrounding mines. In Smithers, he met Jenny Caprani, the daughter of a local storekeeper and a fellow Italian immigrant. They married in 1922. George and Jenny Sodder made their home just outside Fayetteville in a timber-framed house 2 miles north of town. The area had a strong Italian immigrant presence, and by 1923 they welcomed the first of their 10 children. As George's trucking business thrived, the family began to become known as one of the most respected in the region, hardworking, close-knit, and deeply rooted. Yet George's outspoken nature sometimes stirred conflict. His fierce opposition to Benito Mussolini, in particular, led to heated arguments within the local Italian community where loyalties were often divided. Sylvia, the youngest of the Sodder children, was born in 1942. By then, their son Joe had left to serve in World War II. Though Mussolini was deposed the following year, George's outspoken criticism of the dictator had already stirred resentment within parts of the community. In October 1945, a life insurance salesman, angry after being turned away, warned George that his house would, and I quote, go up in smoke, and that his children would be, and I quote again, destroyed, blaming George's remarks about Mussolini. Another visitor, claiming to seek work, circled to the back of the house and ominously commented that the fuse boxes would, and I quote again, cause a fire someday. George was confused. The house had recently been rewired and cleared by the electric company. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, George's older sons noticed a strange car parked along the highway. Its occupants seemed to be watching the younger children as they walked home from school. Now, this is where I want to pause for a second. I don't normally like to insert my own opinions into cases like this, but with all these things being conveniently said, it seems too odd, too many coincidences to be an accident or a freak thing that happened. So, I don't know. There's a lot of speculation, and I guess not really much of it can be proven, but I honestly think something suspicious definitely happened here. But anyway, let's pick back up with Christmas 1945, the day of the fire. The family celebrated on Christmas Eve. Marion, the oldest daughter, had been working at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville, and she surprised 3 of her younger sisters, Martha, Jenny, and Betty, with new toys she had bought for them as gifts. The younger children were so excited that they asked their mother if they could stay up past what would have been their usual bedtime. 10 p.m., Jenny Sodder gave the children a rare gift, permission to stretch the night. Maurice and Lewis were tasked with the final chores, bringing in the cows, feeding the chickens, while the rest of the household settled into sleep. George and the older boys, John and George Jr., were already lost to dreams after a long day's labor. Jenny gathered little Sylvia in her arms and climbed the stairs, leaving the house aglow with laughter and lamplight. 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. A sharp sound in the quiet. Jenny descended to answer it, expecting something ordinary. Instead, a woman's unfamiliar voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Behind her words, laughter, clinking glasses, a party somewhere far from the Sodder home. Jenny later described the woman's laugh as weird, a detail that would echo in her memory like a bell struck once, then forgotten. Returning to bed, Jenny noticed the lights still burning, the curtains wide open, details her children usually tended to when staying up late. Marion had dozed off on the couch. The others, she assumed, had gone up to the attic, their toys tucked beside them, their dreams still wrapped in Christmas. She drew the curtains, turned off the lights, and went back to sleep. Around 1 a.m., Jenny Sodder was stirred from sleep by a sudden noise, a sharp thud on the roof, followed by a rolling sound. She listened for a moment, heard nothing more, and returned to bed. But not long after, she woke again, this time to the unmistakable scent of smoke. Rising quickly, she discovered that George's office was on fire, flames curling around the telephone line and fuse box. She woke George, who then alerted their older sons. Together they rushed to get everyone out. Jenny, George, and 4 of the children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., managed to escape. They called out to the children who had been sleeping upstairs, but no voices answered. The stairway was already engulfed in flames, making it impossible to reach the attic. In the confusion and urgency, John initially told the police he had gone up to alert his siblings, but later clarified that he had only called to them from below. That detail, like so many others from the night, would linger in the family's memory, unresolved but deeply felt. In the chaos of the fire, efforts to call for help were met with unexpected obstacles. The Sodder family's phone line was dead. Marion ran barefoot through the cold to a neighbor's house to contact the Fayetteville Fire Department. A passing driver, seeing the flames, tried to call from a nearby tavern, but either the operator couldn't be reached or the phone itself was broken. Eventually, someone managed to reach the fire department from a phone in town, but precious time had already slipped away. George, barefoot and frantic, tried to climb the exterior wall of the house to reach the attic. He broke a window in the process, cutting his arm. He and his son searched for the ladder they always kept nearby, but it was missing. A water barrel that might have helped was frozen solid. In a final attempt, George tried to start his work trucks to use them as a makeshift ladder, but neither vehicle would start, despite having run perfectly the day before. Each effort was met with failure, not from lack of love or urgency, but from a series of small, cruel impossibilities. The Sodders did everything they could. As the fire consumed the home, the 6 Sodders who had escaped stood helplessly outside watching the flames collapse the house over the course of 45 agonizing minutes. In the absence of any sign or sound from the attic, they could only assume that the 5 children who had remained inside had perished. The Fayetteville Fire Department, understaffed due to wartime shortages and reliant on a phone chain between individual firefighters, did not arrive until later that morning. Chief F.J. Morris later explained that the delay was compounded by his inability to drive the fire truck himself. He had to wait until someone else was available to do so. Among the responders was Jenny's own brother. By the time they arrived, there was little they could do. The house had burned to its foundation. The search through the ashes was brief. By 10 a.m., Chief Morris told the family that no bones had been found, an absence that puzzled and haunted them. Some accounts suggest that fragments may have been discovered, but never disclosed. Modern fire experts have since noted that the search was likely incomplete. Still, Morris concluded that the 5 missing children had died in the fire, suggesting the heat had been intense enough to leave no remains. For the Sodders, that explanation never fully settled. The absence of evidence became its own kind of presence, a silence that lingered, asking questions no one could answer. In the days after the fire, Chief Morris asked George to leave the site untouched so the state fire marshal's office could conduct a proper investigation. But after 4 days of staring at the ruins of their home, George and Jenny could no longer bear the sight. George covered the site with 5 feet of earth, intending to create a memorial garden for the 5 children they believed they had lost. The next day, the local coroner convened an inquest. The jury concluded that the fire had been accidental, caused by faulty wiring. Among the jurors was a man who had previously threatened George, claiming his house would burn and his children would be destroyed, because of George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini. That detail, quietly unsettling, would linger in the background of the Sodders' search for answers. Death certificates for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were issued on December 30th. The local newspaper added to the confusion, stating that all 5 bodies had been found, then contradicting itself within the same article by reporting that only partial remains of 1 child had been recovered. George and Jenny, overcome with grief, did not attend the funeral held on January 2nd, 1946. Their surviving children went in their place, carrying the weight of loss and unanswered questions. In the weeks that followed, as the Sodders tried to rebuild their lives, questions began to surface, gentle at first, then persistent. The official explanation of faulty wiring didn't sit right. If the fire had started electrically, why had the Christmas lights remained on during the early stages of the blaze? The power should have failed, but it hadn't. Then came another unsettling discovery. The family's ladder, which had gone missing the night of the fire, was found at the bottom of a nearby embankment, 75 feet away from where it was usually kept. It had always rested against the house, ready for use. Its absence that night cost them precious time. Its relocation raised quiet alarm. Those details didn't offer answers, but they opened a door. And once opened, the Sodders couldn't help but walk through, step by step, into a mystery that would shape the rest of their lives. As the Sodders continued to seek understanding, another detail emerged that deepened their concern. A telephone repairman informed them that the house's phone line hadn't been destroyed in the fire, but it had been deliberately cut. Whoever did it had climbed 14 feet up the utility pole and reached 2 feet outward to sever the line. It wasn't an accident, it was an intentional act. Around the same time, neighbors reported seeing a man on the property stealing a block and tackle. He was later identified and arrested. The man admitted to theft and claimed he had cut the line, mistaking it for a power cable. He denied any involvement in the fire, but no official record of his identity remains, and his explanation, cutting a utility line while committing a theft, left more questions than answers. Years later, Jenny reflected on the implications. If the man had cut the power line instead of the phone line, she said, she and the rest of the family may not have made it out. The quiet truth stayed with her, a reminder of how close they had come and how much remained unknown. Jenny Sodder struggled to accept the official conclusion that the fire had been hot enough to erase all traces of her 5 missing children. In the ashes of the house, recognizable household appliances remained, along with fragments of the tin roof, evidence that not everything had been reduced to dust. She couldn't help but compare this to a newspaper account she had read around the same time, describing a similar house fire that claimed 7 lives. In that case, skeletal remains of all the victims had been recovered. Seeking clarity, Jenny began her own quiet experiments. She burned small piles of animal bones, hoping to understand what fire could truly consume. None of the bones were ever fully destroyed. Later, she contacted a local crematorium where an employee confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Even at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit sustained for 2 hours, which is far hotter and longer than her home had burned, human bones do not vanish completely. For Jenny, these details didn't offer closure, but they gave shape to her questions, and in the absence of answers, she held fast to what she could: memory, love, and the quiet conviction that something did not add up. In the aftermath of the fire, George Sodder turned to the trucks parked outside, his last hope of reaching his children, but neither vehicle would start. To George, this was no coincidence. He believed that they had been deliberately tampered with, perhaps by the same person who had stolen the block and tackle and severed the phone line earlier that night. Years later, one of George's son-in-law reflected on the moment with tenderness and hindsight. He suggested that in the panic and urgency, George and his sons may have flooded the engines, an innocent mistake made under the unimaginable stress. It was a possibility that softened the edges of suspicion, though it did not erase the ache of uncertainty. There was also the phone call. Just after midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered to hear a woman's voice asking for someone unfamiliar. Laughter echoed in the background. Jenny told her it was the wrong number, and the woman apologized. At the time, it seemed trivial, but in the days that followed, even this small moment took on a strange weight. Someone wondered if it had been connected to the fire, another thread in a tapestry of unease. Investigators eventually located the caller. She confirmed it had been a simple mistake, nothing more. As spring returned to Fayetteville, the Sodder family did what they had promised. They planted flowers in the soil where their home had once stood. The earth had been bulldozed, the ashes cleared, but Jenny Sodder tended the garden with quiet devotion for the rest of her life. Each bloom became a prayer, each petal a memory. But even as the flower grew, so did the family's questions. In early 1946, new accounts began to surface. A bus driver passing through town late on Christmas Eve claimed that he had seen figures near the Sodder home, throwing what he described as balls of fire. The image was strange, unsettling, and hard to dismiss. Months later, as the snow melted and the land began to breathe again, young Sylvia found something in the bush. A small, hard, dark green object, rubbery and round. George examined it and remembered Jenny's account of a loud thump on the roof just before the fire. To him, it resembled a pineapple bomb, a type of hand grenade or incendiary device used in wartime. The family began to believe the fire had not started from faulty wiring, as the fire marshal had concluded, but from the roof, deliberately set. There was no way to prove it, but the discovery added another layer to their grief. The possibility that what they had endured was not just tragic, but intentional. In the months following the fire, the Sodder family continued to search not only for answers, but for signs of their children. A few witnesses came forward with accounts that offered glimmers of possibility. One woman, watching the fire from the road, said she saw children looking out from a passing car. Another, working at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, recalled serving breakfast to a group of children the next morning. She remembered a car with a Florida license plate parked nearby. These stories were never verified, but the Sodders received them with quiet attention, holding space for what might be true. Wanting to understand more, the family hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from Golly Bridge. Tinsley's work uncovered troubling details. He learned that the insurance salesman who had once threatened George over his political views had served on the coroner's jury, the same group that had ruled the fire accidental. It was a detail that unsettled the family, adding to their sense that something had been overlooked. Tinsley also heard a rumor that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had found something in the ashes, a heart, or what he believed to be one. According to the story, Morris placed it in a metal box and buried it quietly. When asked, Morris led officials to the site. The object was exhumed and examined. It turned out to be beef liver. Some believed Morris had placed it there in an attempt to offer closure. Others saw it as a misstep, however well-intentioned. George Sodder never stopped searching. One day, while reading a magazine, he saw a photo of a young ballet dancers in New York City. One of the girls looked strikingly like Betty. Moved by the resemblance, George drove all the way to the school, hoping to see her in person, but obviously his requests were denied. He returned home without answers, but not without trying. He also reached out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, believing that his children may have been taken. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover responded personally, expressing sympathy but explaining that the case fell outside of the Bureau's jurisdiction, unless local authorities requested their involvement. The Fayetteville Police and Fire Departments declined to do so. George Sodder returned to the ruins of his home, not with resignation, but with resolve. He persuaded Oscar Hunter, a respected pathologist from Washington, D.C., to oversee a meticulous search of the soil where the house once stood. What they found were echoes, a child's dictionary, scattered coins, and fragments of bone. The bones were small vertebrae. They were sent to Marshall T. Newman at the Smithsonian Institution. Newman's analysis was clinical but haunting. The vertebrae belonged to someone aged 16 to 22, too old to be Maurice, the eldest of the missing children, who was only 14, and yet the report allowed for a sliver of possibility. Sometimes a boy of Maurice's age could show advanced development. Marshall T. Newman's final report offered no comfort. The vertebrae showed no signs of fire. In a blaze that should have left full skeletons, this absence was deeply unsettling. Newman concluded the bones likely came from the soil George had bulldozed onto the site, perhaps from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, though no one could explain how or why. The Smithsonian returned the fragments to George in September 1949. Their whereabouts today are unknown, like so much else in the story. The investigation stirred national attention. In 1950, the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings, but after the spotlight faded, Governor Okie L. Pattison and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders the case was, and I quote, hopeless. The state closed its file. Even the FBI, which briefly considered the possibility of interstate kidnapping, eventually stepped away. 2 years of searching yielded no answers. When the official investigations ended, the Sodder family began their own. They printed flyers with children's photos, offering a $5,000 reward, soon doubled for any information that could bring even one child home. In 1952, they erected a billboard at the site of the house and another along U.S. Route 60 near Ansted. These signs became more than pleas for help, they became landmarks. Silent sentinels watching over Fayetteville's traffic, bearing witness to a mystery that refused to fade. The billboard stirred memories and stories. One came from Ida Crutchfield, who ran a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia. She claimed that about a week after the fire, 5 children arrived around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, adults she described as of Italian extraction. When she tried to speak to the children, one man responded with a hostile glare in rapid Italian. The group left early the next morning. Her account, however, was clouded by time. She had only seen photos of the children 2 years after the fire and waited 5 years before coming forward. Investigators today question the credibility of her story. But for the Sodders, every whisper was worth listening to. Every sighting, no matter how uncertain, was a thread in the tapestry of possibility. George Sodder became a pilgrim of hope. Long after the fire, long after the billboards had become landmarks, he continued to follow every lead, no matter how improbable, no matter how far. A woman in St. Louis claimed Martha was hidden in a convent. A bar patron in Texas said he overheard two strangers speaking about Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. None of these tips led to answers, but George followed them anyway. Even when a relative of Jenny's in Florida had children who resembled his own, George needed proof before he could rest. In 1967, another letter arrived. A woman in the Houston area claimed Lewis had confessed his true identity to her after drinking too much. She believed both Lewis and Maurice were alive, living somewhere in Texas. George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, made the journey. They found the men she named, but both denied being the missing sons. Grover later said that George never fully believed the denial. In 1967, a letter arrived at the Sodder home, no return address, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man around 30 with eyes and bone structure that stirred something deep in Jenny's memory. Lewis would have been in his 30s, if he had survived. On the back of the photo, a cryptic message was scrawled. Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. The meaning was unclear, but the resemblance was undeniable. The Sodders had hired a private investigator to travel to Central City and follow the trail. He vanished. No report, no return, just another silence in the story full of them. Still, the photo became sacred. They added it to the billboard, carefully omitting the location and details, afraid that if Lewis was alive, publicity might endanger him. At home, they enlarged the image and placed it above the fireplace. By the late 1960s, George Sodder had begun to speak openly about the toll of the search. It's like hitting a rock wall, he said. We can't go any further. Yet, even in that admission, he held fast to hope. Time is running out for us, he added, but we only want to know if they did die in the fire. We want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. George passed away in 1969, never having found the answers he sought. Jenny remained in the family home, surrounded by memories and the quiet persistence of love. She added rooms, fenced the property, and continued to tend the garden where the house had once stood. For the rest of her life, she wore black in mourning. The billboard stayed up, weathered by time and seasons, a public testament to a private ache. Their children carried the search forward, each in their own way. John chose silence, saying only that the family should accept what had happened and moved on. The others continued to ask questions, to listen for whispers, and to hold space for possibility. When Jenny died in 1989, the family finally took the billboard down, not as an act of surrender, but as a gesture of peace. The mystery remained, but so did the love. In the years after the fire, the surviving Sodder children, joined by their own families, continued to seek answers. They followed leads, spoke with journalists, and kept the story alive in the hope that the truth might still surface. Some believed that the children had taken in connection with an extortion attempt, possibly by someone who knew of the planned arson and promised they'd be safe. There were theories of relocation, even whispers of Italy. But more than anything, there was a shared belief. If the children had survived, they may have stayed away to protect those that they loved. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest sibling, carried that belief quietly but firmly. She was in the house that night, her earliest memories shaped by the fire and its aftermath. She stayed close to her parents, especially her father, often sitting with him late into the night, talking through possibilities. I experienced their grief for a long time, she said, and she meant it. Her daughter later shared that Sylvia had made a promise to her parents to never let the story be forgotten. Sylvia kept that promise. She spoke with care, followed the case with dignity, and passed the story on with love. When she died in 2021, she left behind not just unanswered questions, but a legacy of quiet strength and devotion. In the 21st century, the family's efforts have come to include online forums like websleuths.com, in addition to media coverage. The increase in the latter has led to some who have examined the case to believe the children did, in fact, die in 1945. George Bragg, a local author who wrote about the case in his 2012 book, West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believed that John was telling the truth in his original account when he said he had tried to physically awaken his siblings before fleeing the house. He allows that the conclusion may still not be correct. Logic tells you that they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic. Stacey Horn, who did a segment on the case for a National Republic radio around its 60th anniversary in 2005, also believes that the children's death in the fire is the most plausible solution. In a contemporaneous post on her blog with the material she had cut from her story for Time, she noted that the fire had continued to smolder all night after the house collapsed, and that 2 hours was not enough time to search the ash thoroughly. Even if it had been, the firefighters may not have known what to look for. However, she said, there is enough genuine weirdness about the whole thing that if someday it is learned that the children did not die in the fire, I won't be shocked. In 2022, the History Channel aired an episode of its series, History's Greatest Mysteries, that detailed the events of the case. And that's about all that we have heard for the case of the Sodder children. And honestly, who knows what really happened that day? I mean, it's been years and we may never get answers. Thank you for sitting with me tonight beneath the quiet branches as we honored the Sodder's family story. A story not just of mystery, but of devotion, memory, and the kind of love that never lets go. Though the fire burned long ago, the questions remain, and so does the promise Sylvia Sodder Paxton made to her parents, to keep the story alive. She did so with quiet strength, and now that promise belongs to all of us who choose to remember. If you carry a piece of the story, an old photo, a family memory, a detail passed down, please consider sharing it. Even the smallest truth can bring light to a place that's waited in shadow for far too long. If you have any information, even the smallest shred of a detail that could lead to answers for this story, please consider reaching out to the FBI or local West Virginia authorities. I will try to put links and stuff where you can report any of these findings. But until next time, may we continue to listen with tenderness, speak with integrity, and hold space for the stories that ask to be remembered. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one.